Welcome to another episode of Critic.Reading.Writing. My name is Quayson, and I am a professor of English at Stanford University. This week's episode will be focusing on the film Black Panther, directed by Ryan Coogler. It will be shown that the film illustrates a form of Black Atlantic nostalgia that connects the Black diaspora to the continent of Africa in a particularly complex way. We will also see that the theme of nostalgia in the film allows us to think of the different forms of African dispersal, not just to the New World from the 16th century to the 19th century, but also following decolonization in the middle of the 20th century. All these waves of the African diaspora establish different relations of nostalgia to the continent so that it becomes productive to compare various depictions of the relationship between the two. Because of its immense success as a Marvel movie, Black Panther allows us to start thinking about these comparisons from various perspectives. Let me start off first of all by saying what a great personal sense of loss I felt on learning of the passing of Chadwick Boseman in August of 2020. He seemed so full of life and brought to the T'Challa role in Black Panther such poise, such elegance, and such deliberation that I thought of him as the model of an African chief, despite the role being entirely fictionalized. It is clear that Boseman put a great deal of work into his performance so as to properly echo the structure of feeling that comes with being an African chief commanding so many resources and power and traditional authority untainted by colonialism. The idea of an organic leader that marries the demands of governance with the acknowledgement of the significant role of women is an ideal that was present in many parts of Africa, such as in the legendary Kingdom of Dahomey in the 18th and 19th centuries, but that now we have to reconstruct following the effects of slavery, colonialism, and post-colonial political cynicism. T'Challa, the Dora Milaje, and the entire world of Wakanda pose this as a distinct imaginative possibility, and indeed something that we ought to quest for. I also want to acknowledge the amazing work that has been done on the film by Anania Kabir, Dilip Menon, Adeleke Adeyeko, and Tululupe Akinwole, among various others. I draw great inspiration from all of them for my own thinking on the film. The work of these critics appears in a special issue of the Cambridge Journal of Postcolonial Literary Inquiry and will be cited fully in the suggested reading section to this episode. Black Panther places the question of the relationship between diaspora and the homeland at the heart of defining the kingdom of Wakanda, and thus, by extension, to Africa in general. There are three ideologies that struggle for ascendancy in the kingdom of Wakanda. The first, and to my mind the least interesting, is the one that holds that Wakanda must insulate itself from the rest of the world and enjoy exclusive benefits from vibranium and the phenomenal technological achievements that it has enabled for them. This ostrich head in the sand attitude is somewhat undermined by the fact that Wakanda regularly sends out spies to all corners of the world to find out what the rest of mankind has been up to. This elaborate network of intelligence gathering seems to be entirely benign, except, of course, for when one of their war dogs sells vibranium to an outsider in the person of the cynical Ulysses Claw. This ultimately triggers reprisals on the wayward son of the soil, as we see at the start of the movie when King T'Chaka pays a visit to his brother Prince Njobu in Oakland, California, and ends up killing him. This link between intelligence gathering and the potential for political reorientation is somewhat muted for the traditional Wakandans inside of the kingdom itself. But because it is something that is not dead, but merely dormant, the link is quickly revived by Killmonger when he takes over the kingdom later in the movie. And he gains immediate support from Wakabi, military leader of the Guardians of the Borderlands of Wakanda. The second ideology struggling for ascendancy is represented by the character of Nakia. Hers is an appeal for Wakanda to use its formidable technology to help the poor in the outside world. As she puts it to T'Challa in their stroll through downtown Wakanda, we could provide aid and access to technology and refuge to those who need it. Nakia's sentiments are beautiful. However, her form of state-sponsored charity has a worrying whiff of the charity complex much enamored of the West. This charity complex is especially evident around Christmas, when the adoption of goats, children, school buildings, or some other object is used as a conduit for the channeling of often Christian fellow feeling from the West. The difference between NGO, Christian, and other independent associations, charity drives from the West toward the rest of the world, and that of the state-sponsored variety Nakia earnestly espouses in Black Panther, is that in the long span of human history, all state-sponsored charity ends up tipping into designs on other people's territory. The history of the conversion of pastoral care into social welfare, of which state-sponsored charity is only one variant, has always been aligned to the civilizing missions that were themselves precursors of colonialism. Thus, Nakia's appeal for state-sponsored charity from Wakanda also couches what is effectively the preface to colonialism in the guise of universal brotherhood. Though the movie encourages us to take a benign view of her ideological position, the relation between her view and that of Killmonger must be read dialectically for us to grasp their true implications for the soul of Wakanda. Killmonger's ideology is by far the most complex, and by the same token, the most far-reaching in its implications. For Killmonger represents what I would describe as the articulation of Black Atlantic melancholy. Extrapolating from Sigmund Freud's discussion in Mourning and Melancholia, melancholia can be understood as making itself manifest in three interrelated stages. First comes the loss of the loved object. The reasons Freud assigns for this loss vary, but in melancholia, the consequential loss of the loved object is not the substitution of the lost object by another object of attention or desire, but rather a form of recalcitrant non-substitution. Unlike in mourning, where after a requisite temporal lapse, the lost object is substituted by another object of desire, in melancholia, the libidinal charge that was guaranteed by the lost object is introjected by the bereaved person. The libidinal economy of affects and drives released from the loved object is assimilated into the process of ego formation and comes to distort the ego. And yet, this assimilation does not produce mere nostalgia, but in various degrees also triggers resentment and anger toward the lost object. Even though the resentment and anger are properly due to the lost object for being ultimately inaccessible, because it has now been assimilated into the melancholic's ego, his or her ego then comes to experience contradictory feelings and emotions that then become aspects of the ego itself. I have already outlined aspects of this process of melancholia in our episode on Tayyip Saleh's Season of Migration to the North, with reference to the relationship between the unnamed narrator of the novel and Mustafa Said, the central protagonist. And I urge you to take a look at that episode to get a fuller understanding of the representation of melancholia. The third phase, which is not really Freud's, but is an interpolation I want to introduce, inspired by a question that Annlin Sheng poses in her book, The Melancholy of Race. And Sheng asks a very fascinating question, namely, when and under what conditions does grief become grievance? And what are the psychic mechanisms of this transposition? As I hope to show presently, in Black Panther, the process of transforming grief to grievance is inexorably tied to the trauma of diaspora. The concept of diaspora is conventionally used to refer to the violent dispersal of peoples from the homeland and is currently assumed to cover a wide range of cultures and ethnic groups. But diasporas have different genealogies and concomitantly might also be argued to reveal different affective economies. What the field of diaspora studies defines as victim diasporas are distinctive for being constituted both by a foundational event of dispersal and also, as importantly, by the interdiction against return. These principles are amply illustrated in the Jewish, the African American, and Armenian diasporas, among various others. There are other categories of diaspora, but the important thing to note is that these categories are not mutually exclusive, but can be co-constitutive depending on the historical configuration of the diaspora in question. We will devote an entire segment of episodes later on to literature and diaspora studies. Transposing Freud's discussion of melancholia onto the formation of the African American diaspora, we might argue that what constitutes the lost object is the homeland, which moves from territorial materiality of Africa and into the domain of myth. This is not an unusual process and may be seen in myths of the homeland for many different diaspora groups. However, because historically the return to the African homeland was effectively interdicted both by the laws that shackled slaves to their conditions of servitude and by the insurmountable distance between them and the African homeland. What we find then is that there's a trigger of melancholic processes of interdiction. What I want to suggest here is that Black Atlantic melancholy transcends the Freudian framework in a number of significant respects. Apart from the contradictory feelings of attraction and repulsion that Africa triggers in Black populations of the New World, Black Atlantic melancholy also names the inescapable recognition that the Middle Passage and plantation slavery were the fundamental incubators of the excess of violence and passion, and that these excesses were sometimes both articulated in the same instances. But Black Atlantic melancholy also comes with a strong ethical claim that pertains specifically to the rupture that is represented by the Middle Passage and slavery. This is how I interpret Ansheng's question about the transformation of grief into grievance. For in the African American example, grievance goes beyond complaint to encompass strong ethical claims regarding both historical and political representation. At the heart of the African American ethical claim to such representation is an interrogation of the pastness of the past and how it is taken to impact upon the present. While everyone may agree that the past is past, they may also strongly disagree about how past it is and how much it impinges upon the present social and political arrangements. In this respect, it is not unusual for Blacks, racial minorities, and other equity-seeking groups in the United States and other parts of the Western world to argue that because of continuing injustice, the traumatic past of slavery and the Black Atlantic is far from entirely abrogated, but that it continues to distort lives in the present. Beneficiaries of hegemonic arrangements take the opposite view, arguing that the past is firmly past and that equity-seeking groups ought to bury their attachment to the past and move on or get on with it. Keeping in mind that this ethical claim has to do more with the historiography of trauma than of the apportioning of blame, even though the two are often conflated in the minds of both victims and perpetrators. We can list the Black thinkers that have reflected on this ethical claim to include thinkers such as W.B. Du Bois, Orlando Patterson, James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, Malcolm X, and Saidiya Hartman, among many others. Now, to go back to Killmonger's ideology for Wakanda. Killmonger arrives in Wakanda with a specific grievance relating to his sense of abandonment by the leaders of the kingdom. He is a member of the royal household and thus has equal right not just to the throne but to a definition of what Wakanda ought to be. The middle passage route of his grievance is given explicit articulation toward the end of the movie when, on being invited by T'Challa to be healed of the wound that he has sustained in the hand-to-hand combat with him, Killmonger says, "For what? So you can just lock me up? Nah, just bury me in the ocean with my ancestors that jumped from the ships because they knew death was better than bondage." For this particular grievance to make sense, however, Ryan Coogler has had to undertake a major revision to the original history of Wakanda as set out in the earliest comic books, as we find amply demonstrated in the article by Dilip Menon we noted earlier. The revision of Wakanda's origin story is done more by implication than directly, and is achieved by obscuring the fact that in its earliest articulation, Wakanda was located in a landlocked part of Central East Africa, roughly in the area covered today by the Central African Republic and a bit of the Democratic Republic of Congo. But if that is the case, then the historical Wakanda, as conceived of in the early Marvel comic books, firmly faced the Indian Ocean rather than the Atlantic, with the immediate implication that slavery from that region of Africa was more geared toward the Arabian Peninsula and the Indian subcontinent rather to the Americas and the New World. As an aside, we should also note that in the movie itself, apart from Killmonger's wish to be buried in the ocean, there's no description of Wakanda by any of the other characters that suggests that it is close to any ocean or seafront. The way the film gets around this problem of location is to introduce a second genealogy of Wakanda through the exhibits on display in the British Museum in the second segment of the film. This second segment follows the opening sequence of the movie when Prince Njobu recounts to his son, a young Killmonger, the story of where they came from. And he tells him of the falling of the vibranium meteorite and then goes through the wars among the various tribes and the appearance of the heart-shaped herb that bestows superpowers on the first Black Panther, who then brings the warring tribes together, except for the Jabari of the hills, to found Wakanda. Whereas this story locates Wakanda within the Central African geography of the original Marvel comics, the museum scene subtly shifts this by firmly placing Wakanda's main artifact among those plundered from the peoples of Benin, Ashanti, and other ethnic groups in West Africa during the colonial period. In the museum scene, Killmonger refutes the West African provenance of the Wakandan artifact indirectly by saying nah to the museum curator's explanation of its West African source. What he is more interested in is that the vibranium axe that he has his eyes on was stolen by colonizers and that he has the right to relieve the museum of it. But by placing the Wakandan artifact within the plundered ruins of West African societies, the movie has effectively inserted a Black Atlantic genealogy for the Wakandan artifact in place of the Indian Ocean one that would have naturally been its due. Coupled to the fact that Killmonger is from Oakland in California, the museum scene then allows Killmonger and the rest of the movie to invoke a form of Black Atlantic melancholy as central to his characterization. By opening with a scene where King T'Chaka visits his brother in Jobu and then kills him for his misdeeds in helping Ulysses Claw to steal vibranium from Wakanda, the film immediately retranscribes Black Atlantic melancholy as a defining aspect of the Wakandan royal family saga. That is to say, the emotional pain of the Middle Passage is overlaid onto the disjunctive narrative of Wakanda's royal family, rendering what is a rivalry between brothers, that is to say, King T'Chaka and his brother Prince Njobu, as the progenitor of a discourse of diasporic abandonment. Even Prince T'Challa condemns his father for abandoning his young cousin in the throes of the diaspora after his father is killed, no less by his own brother. But this abandonment of kin that we all can identify as the sign of terrible moral lapse is then resignified as the film progresses as the symbolic abandonment of all diasporic peoples of African descent. This is ultimately what places Nakia's state-sponsored charity in close proximity to Killmonger's idea of worldwide Black freedom struggle supported by Wakanda's technology. They both want a correction of Africa's abandonment of its diverse diasporas, but from seemingly opposite directions. This narrative thread also surreptitiously smuggles into the Killmonger story many accusations of blame and responsibility that are heard from New World descendants of Africa about their homeland. It forms the central argument, for example, for Saidiya Hartman's beautifully written masterpiece, Lose Your Mother, in which she is at pains to trace the primal scene of Black diasporic formation, not to the slave ship, but to the slave dungeon in Africa itself. Hartman resolutely discards any romantic view of the African village as the starting point of diasporic African identity, and rather insists upon tracking the insensitivities and moral lack of African slave traders that populated the slave dungeons with Black bodies in the first place. In Black Panther, Killmonger thus represents the aggrieved peoples of the Black diaspora coming to extract justice from those impervious to their woes and tribulations that remained in the homeland of Africa unperturbed. What complicates the template of Black Atlantic melancholia I have set out thus far, however, is something linked to Killmonger's character formation, but that somehow manages to be obscured by his intense sense of grievance directed at Wakanda. According to agent Everett Ross, Killmonger is one of ours, that is to say, that he is a CIA agent. Killmonger was born Eric Stevens, finished Annapolis aged 19, went to MIT for grad school, then joined the SEALs and went straight to Afghanistan, where he wrapped up confirmed kills like it was a video game. He joined a ghost unit of JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, whose main training enabled them to drop off the grid so that they could commit assassinations and take out governments. This is from Agent Ross. Everything that is described about Killmonger suggests that he is an American native son, in the phrase first used by Richard Wright as the title of his famous novel set in 1930s Chicago. But Killmonger is a native son not only because he's native to California, therefore America, but because he's completely of a piece with America's militaristic imperial ideology. For when he comes to Wakanda preaching the export of military hardware and technology to free oppressed black people everywhere in the world, he is essentially articulating a form of American imperial ideology well known in the history of the world. True, Killmonger is speaking about revolution, the arming of the oppressed to be able to shake off the yoke of their oppression. But by couching revolution in this particular militaristic idiom, Killmonger also articulates something that is also quintessentially American, namely that these freed black peoples all over the world can best be ruled from Wakanda itself, and by him, Killmonger, as its new king and leader. To be sure, he's not the only character in the film that harbors this ideology. The idea is equally split between his father Njobu, who first expresses it when speaking to his skeptical brother in the scene that we referenced already, and Wakabi, Wakanda's head of Homeland Security, or in the film's own idiom, the protector of the borderlands. The fact that the defender of the borderlands is clearly militaristic and that his thinking coincides perfectly with that of Killmonger and of Njobu before him means that irrespective of the royal family's dominant ideas of protective isolationism, the idea of territorial expansion has always been something that also lies at the heart of the Wakandan ruling classes itself. This then takes us back to Wakanda's practice of sending out war dogs, as they are called, to see what the rest of the world is up to. Their description as war dogs is instructive, for why would they be called war dogs if Wakanda has always been determined not to embark on war? The point I want to close on, however, is on the very nuanced ways in which Black Panther modulates the idea of Black Atlantic melancholy in such a way as to make of it a really productive talking point of our own cultural moment. While in the film, the idea of a Pan-Africanist revolution is contaminated by being articulated in the same idiom as American militaristic imperial ideology, the central dream of freeing black peoples everywhere from the shackles of neocolonialism, self-doubt, poverty, drugs, and second-class citizen status is not to be discounted lightly. Whether this contamination marks a defect in Black Panther or simply illustrates the fact that, like all cultural products, it is inescapably overdetermined by the political unconscious that necessarily shapes all cultural production in America, is a question that we need to find an answer to urgently. Wakanda forever. Thank you very much. Please remember to check out the suggested readings in the episode description. And if you like this episode, give a thumbs up, subscribe and share, hit the notifications bell so that you do not miss out on any upcoming episodes, and enter your comments in the section below. See you next week.